This footage was captured on a cold, moonless night in early March. A lone girl, her name never released, appears on camera at exactly 11:32 p.m., standing on a silent porch in a neighborhood known for its stillness after dark. She raises her fist and knocks softly, as though the sound itself might invite something she's desperate to avoid. The hush of the street is thick, almost suffocating. No traffic, no voices, only the gentle rustle of a breeze that seems to die the moment it touches this particular house. She looks over her shoulder with anxious, darting eyes, scanning every shadow on the sidewalk and beyond. At first glance, she appears vulnerable, slight build, unsteady posture, the kind of figure that might collapse if a gust of wind grew too strong. Yet there's a tension in her stance, like a coiled wire ready to snap. Her hoodie is damp around the edges from a faint drizzle that had passed through the area earlier in the night. A single porch light flickers above her, casting her shadow in jagged shapes against the worn-out boards. Seconds pass in this tense tableau. She knocks again, this time with more urgency. If one were to watch the recording closely, they might discern her lips forming the words, "Please open up." It's unclear if she's begging for help or demanding something else entirely. No immediate answer comes from within. The door remains closed, and the only response is the echo of her own desperate plea reverberating off the old wood. That's when the headlights appear. Dim at first, then piercing as a white van, seemingly out of place on this quiet street, turns the corner without so much as tapping the brakes. Its lights remain off until the very last moment, an odd detail that might go unnoticed at a casual glance, but in retrospect feels deliberate. The van coasts to a stop at the curb, and four figures step out, each masked, each clad in dark clothing. One of them carries a crowbar, another cradles a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. From the camera's angle, it's difficult to see their faces, or even if they have faces at all under those masks. They move in unison, purposeful but unhurried, as if confident of their objective. The girl notices them immediately. A silent gasp parts her lips. She taps on the door again, more frantically now, but still there's no reply from inside. Her gaze flicks from the front door to the approaching figures. She's trapped in a standoff with fate, torn between flight and the faint hope that whoever's behind that door will finally let her in. Her knocking becomes pounding. Her words sound like a broken record. "Open up, open up, open up." The four masked strangers draw closer. Their collective footsteps barely register on the audio, muffled by the grass and the hush of the night, but the tension is palpable. One might imagine a heartbeat thrumming in the background, a sound more psychological than literal, as if the viewer's own pulse amplifies into the scene. The figures form a semicircle around the porch steps, blocking any escape down the sidewalk. The lone porch light flickers again, casting silhouettes that dance and distort on the worn boards. The girl's face is illuminated, stark with fear and something else, an emotion that's harder to name, somewhere between despair and defiance. Suddenly, the front door creaks, but only slightly, as though someone might be on the other side, pressing against it. There's no voice, no chain being unlatched. The girl presses her ear to the wood, and her expression shifts from terror to a fleeting spark of hope. Yet before she can call out again, one of the masked figures points the crowbar at her, a silent threat that chills the air more effectively than any words could. She doesn't move. She stays pressed to the door, as if the closeness might will it to open. Moments like these feel elastic, stretching far beyond their actual duration. A single second can expand into an eternity, each breath taking on monumental importance. In this breathless interlude, we notice details. The slight tremor in the girl's hands, the metallic glint of the crowbar under the flickering light, the hush that lays over the entire scene like a heavy blanket. Then, something changes. The front door, which seemed on the verge of opening, remains stuck fast. No one steps forward to let her in. The girl's eyes brim with panic. The masked quartet, now at the base of the steps, appear to exchange a glance, a shift of posture that suggests silent communication. They're planning their next move. The girl senses this, her body tenses. She moves to the edge of the porch, risking a sprint around them, but they spread out, blocking every angle. She's cornered. A low voice emerges from one of the masked men, though we can't make out the words. It almost sounds like he's taunting her. Another figure points to the door. The girl shakes her head, as though begging them not to force it open. An odd reversal of roles. She wants inside, but also doesn't want them to break in. And then, as though to answer the unspoken threat, the crowbar-wielding figure sets foot on the first step. The porch boards creak under the weight. The girl's eyes dart to the door handle, praying for it to turn from the inside. It doesn't budge. Her next knock is frantic, verging on hysteria, yet there's an undercurrent of frustration, perhaps even fury. She mouths something, possibly cursing at whoever is behind that door for leaving her out here with these intruders. By now, the tension is suffocating. The silhouettes shift once more, and the figure with the duffel bag gently places it on the ground. An ominous gesture, like a craftsman setting down his toolkit before beginning a job. Meanwhile, the crowbar angles upward, aimed at the lock, but the masked man hesitates, waiting for a signal from the apparent leader of the group. The girl looks directly at this leader, desperation etched in every line of her face. It's as though they share a history, a bond twisted by betrayal or necessity. Her eyes accuse him of something that cannot be named, something that preceded this moment by days, months, maybe years. In the silence that follows, the camera's microphone picks up the faint sound of a second voice from inside the house. It's unclear whether it's a cry, a groan, or merely the house settling under the weight of time. Whatever it is, it makes the girl go still. Her gaze flicks back to the door one final time, and we can see her lips shaping the same repeated phrase, over and over again. "Don't open!" Suddenly, the door jerks inward an inch, the chain clearly latched from within. A pale sliver of light spills out, and a voice, raspy with either age or fear, utters a single word. "Why?" The girl doesn't answer. She glances at the masked men, and her expression grows more frantic. The figure with the crowbar steps forward, extends an arm as if to yank the door open with brute force. A violent confrontation appears imminent. But just as the tension peaks, the footage cuts to static for a fraction of a second. When it resumes, the front porch is empty, the door is shut, the girl is gone, so are the four masked figures. The van remains parked at the curb, its headlights still turned off. No sound breaks the hush except the soft hum of the street lamp. The entire confrontation, it seems, has vanished into thin air. Only one clue remains, barely visible at the edge of the camera's range. The duffel bag, lying on its side, half-zipped, like someone forgot to pick it up in the rush. Stories like these aren't supposed to happen in suburbs like this. It's the kind of place with neatly trimmed lawns, neighbors who wave hello, and porch swings that creak in lazy arcs on summer evenings. Yet on that night, the cameras captured a very different reality, one where a terrified girl, a hidden occupant, and four faceless strangers came together in a scene that left more questions than answers. Police reports mention forced entry marks on the side of the house, but no sign of struggle inside, just a single overturned chair in the hallway and muddy footprints leading to the basement door. The occupant, an elderly man living alone, was nowhere to be found, and no official record exists of the girl or the masked men. It's as if they melted into the darkness. But people talk, rumors swirl, each more outlandish than the last. Some claim the girl was part of a larger criminal enterprise, working undercover or double-crossing the masked men at the last second. Others whisper she was a victim, a pawn coerced into luring someone into a trap. Still others speak of supernatural forces, pointing to the abrupt static on the footage and the impossible way everyone vanished. Most, however, just shake their heads and move on, content to label it an unsolved curiosity and pray it never crosses their path. This is only the beginning. To truly understand the events of that night, we have to delve into the days leading up to it, into the stories of every person involved. There's a reason the girl was there, a reason the masked men followed, and a reason the occupant stayed hidden behind that locked door. Behind every locked door there are secrets. Some are best left sealed away, but in this case the door was forced open, or nearly so. What spilled out in that moment would ripple through the entire neighborhood, leaving a trail of fear and speculation in its wake. It started 3 days prior, in a different part of town. A convenience store camera picked up footage of a girl matching the one who appeared on the porch. She stumbled into the store around midnight, disoriented and visibly shaken, buying only a pack of gum and 2 bottles of water. The clerk on duty, a retiree named Sam, later recalled how she kept glancing at a parked car outside, as if she was afraid someone might burst in at any second. She paid in small bills, then hurried out without waiting for change. Minutes later, a white van pulled up, and several people jumped out, though the camera angle and poor lighting made positive identification impossible. Sam insisted one of them was the same girl, but the hooded sweatshirt made it hard to be sure. From there, the clues become murky. An abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, once used as a distribution center, appeared to be a focal point. Locals reported seeing suspicious activity, lights flickering inside at odd hours, cars coming and going in the dead of night. No official complaints were filed, probably because people didn't want to get involved. It's that kind of town where folks mind their own business, especially when trouble knocks. Someone claiming to be a truck driver posted online about hearing screams from the building while he was passing by at 2:00 a.m., but that post disappeared days later. The truck driver, if he existed, never came forward. The next confirmed sighting of the girl was from a dashcam belonging to a taxi driver. He caught her standing at an intersection, near enough to the same warehouse that it can't be coincidence. She was talking to a tall figure dressed in dark clothing, though their face wasn't visible. The tall figure handed her something small, a flash drive or a key, perhaps, and pointed toward the center of town. The dashcam audio picked up muffled voices, the girl repeating the words, "I don't want to go back there." The tall figure responded, "You don't have a choice." Then the taxi turned a corner and the footage ended. This was about 48 hours before she showed up on that porch. If we trace her steps carefully, we see a pattern of avoidance. She took side streets, cut through parking lots, and changed direction abruptly, almost as if she knew she was being watched. Or perhaps she was simply paranoid. Either way, she stayed off main roads and away from bright lights. It's remarkable she was caught on camera at all, but in this digital age, eyes are everywhere. Police made no official statements, not yet, but you can imagine the speculation growing behind the scenes. A missing persons report might have been filed, but if so, it wasn't made public. Names remained elusive. Meanwhile, the four masked men also made scattered appearances in various security footage. A blurred figure in a ski mask at a gas station pump, a hooded silhouette near a payphone, a group of shadows passing through a poorly lit underpass. Each sighting cryptic, none conclusive enough to confirm identities or motive. By day, they vanished, leaving no trace. By night, they prowled like ghosts. People whispered about a professional crew pulling off heists, or perhaps a cult practicing strange rituals. The imagination, once sparked, tends to run wild. What ties them together is the white van, a vehicle that appears in multiple frames, always half in shadow. No license plate, or at least none that can be read. Sometimes parked, sometimes cruising slowly, scanning the streets. Whoever they were, they seemed well-organized, disciplined in their movements. No one reported seeing them lose their cool or break formation, except that moment on the porch when the crowbar was raised in readiness. That was perhaps the only time their calm exterior cracked, revealing a simmering intent beneath. The occupant of the house on that porch night, an elderly man named Mr. Harlan, had lived there for decades. A widower with no children, he rarely ventured outside except to buy groceries or water his lawn. Neighbors described him as polite but distant, the kind of person who'd nod a greeting but never invite conversation. No one remembered seeing visitors come by. Some said he had health issues, others speculated he was simply reclusive. Yet that night, if the rasping voice behind the door truly was his, it meant he was still present, still aware. But why didn't he open the door for the frantic girl? Why only crack it a few inches, ask why, and then vanish? Investigators would later note that the door itself showed no signs of a forced break-in from the front. The side entrance, however, bore fresh scratches near the lock, and the back window had been jimmied open. So perhaps the masked men gained entry that way, or perhaps the girl did. Inside, police found Mr. Harlan's living room largely undisturbed. A half-eaten sandwich lay on a plate in the kitchen, the bread now stale. A single mug of cold tea sat on the counter. The basement door was open, and footprints led down into darkness, but the overhead light bulb had been smashed. No sign of a struggle, no trail of blood. Only footprints that meandered in circles as though multiple people had gone down, then come back up. In a corner of the basement, hidden under a dusty tarp, lay old furniture and storage boxes. One box was pried open. Its contents remain unknown to the public. Police never released an inventory if they took one at all. What came next was the strangest part. No one was found in the house. Not the girl, not the masked men, not Mr. Harlan. The footprints led nowhere else. The back door was locked from the inside. Neighbors saw nothing unusual except the white van, which had apparently left just before dawn. It's like the house swallowed them all. This led some people to spin wild supernatural theories. Hidden passages, occult rituals, dimensional rifts. Others insisted there must be a logical explanation, though none was ever provided. Officially, the case is open but cold, yet there was that duffel bag left on the porch. Inside, investigators found basic break-in tools. A small pry bar, lock picks, a flashlight, and several lengths of rope. Nothing that couldn't be purchased from a hardware store. But there was also a small notebook, water-damaged from the night's drizzle, with pages torn out. Only a few words remained legible. Warehouse, he owes, midnight, and don't trust her. The pronouns were never clarified, but it's not hard to guess that her referred to the girl. This notebook stands as a testament that the masked men didn't trust her, or that they were warned not to. Why then follow her to that house? Why corner her so aggressively, only to disappear along with her? Speculation soared. Some suggested the occupant, Mr. Harlan, was the key, that he held a secret the girl needed to exploit or reveal. Perhaps the masked men were after the same secret. Others posited that Harlan was an innocent bystander, simply caught in the crossfire of a larger scheme. Another angle pointed to the possibility that the girl was never truly a victim, that her knocking and pleading was all an act to lure the occupant into opening the door for the masked men. The contradictory evidence leaves room for every theory under the sun. As the days turned into weeks, sightings of the girl or the masked men dried up. The van no longer appeared on security footage. The warehouse fell silent. Whatever was in play had either concluded or gone deeper underground. Without leads or bodies, the police had little to go on. The media moved on to more pressing concerns. Only the neighbors remained vigilant, spooked by the possibility of a return. Some installed extra deadbolts, others invested in better security systems. Porch lights that had once glowed invitingly now flickered behind heavy shades, turned off early each night, as if to say, "We're not home." Don't knock. But behind the scenes, a few dedicated researchers, amateur sleuths, journalists, internet forum dwellers, pieced together more fragments. One intriguing clue emerged. A rumor that Mr. Harlan had a son who died under mysterious circumstances years ago. The official story was a car accident, but whispers suggested a link to illicit business dealings. Could the masked men have ties to that old incident? Could the girl be connected to Mr. Harlan's past? It's all conjecture, but in a story like this, conjecture is all we have. Time passed, and the case slid into urban legend. People recounted the tale of the vanishing porch, referencing the footage of everyone disappearing after that brief cut to static. Some claimed they recognized the girl from a different city, describing a rumored drifter who manipulated criminal groups for her own ends. Others spoke of elaborate real estate scams or hidden fortunes locked away in the suburbs. The more outlandish theories even involved government cover-ups or alien abductions. The door, the van, the missing occupant. These elements became puzzle pieces in a labyrinth no one seemed capable of fully solving. Yet the footage remains, circulated online, analyzed frame by frame. Viewers slow it down to examine every flinch of the girl's face, every subtle movement of the masked men, searching for a sign, something that might crack the case wide open. But the truth, as it often is, proves elusive. Not because it doesn't exist, but perhaps because the parties involved never wanted it to see the light of day. So we return to that question. Why was the girl knocking at Mr. Harlan's door? At a glance, the answer might be simple. She was in trouble, seeking refuge. But the clues suggest a deeper plan, one that required her to be at that door at that time. The repeated phrase, "Don't trust her," from the notebook suggests betrayal was expected. And the occupant's single spoken word, "Why?" hangs like an echo through the case. Why indeed? Why her? Why him? Why that house? Why that night? Some who study these events propose that the girl had orchestrated the entire scenario, possibly under duress, to force a confrontation between the masked men and Mr. Harlan. In this theory, she believed something in that house, documentation, valuables, or a hidden truth, would shift the balance of power in her favor once it was revealed. But the confrontation got out of hand, leading to a stalemate on the porch. Others believe the masked men cornered her, forcing her to track down Mr. Harlan. Perhaps they needed him alive, or some code he possessed. The moment the door chain rattled, everything was poised on a knife's edge. The sudden static break in the footage suggests an outside interference. Someone or something turned the tables in that single moment. If we follow the idea of an outside force, we might consider the possibility of a third party, watching from a distance, ready to intervene if the standoff threatened a greater plan. This nebulous presence might explain how all of them vanished so quickly. The question then becomes, who or what had the power to do that? Rumors of a private security firm or paramilitary group swirl through the local gossip. The warehouse sightings, the hush around the police investigation, and the missing occupant feed this line of thought. Some residents claim to have heard helicopters late that night, though no official flight records show any. A black SUV was reportedly seen idling around the corner from Mr. Harlan's house earlier in the evening, but it vanished along with everything else. In the end, all we have is a swirling mass of speculation, each theory adding layers to a story that remains fundamentally incomplete. Yet the image that endures, more than the van, more than the masked men, is the girl's face as she glances back over her shoulder, eyes wide with a blend of fear and determination. She carries the emotional weight of the entire scene, a silent plea that resonates even with viewers who have never been in her position. Those who watch the footage can't help but project their own narratives onto her. Is she a cunning manipulator or a desperate pawn? Little by little, the story branched into a labyrinthine puzzle, pulling in events from years prior. Perhaps it's more straightforward. A home invasion gone wrong, an attempted robbery with an unwilling accomplice. Yet the simplest explanations rarely hold up under the odd details. The static, the complete disappearance, the cryptic clues in the notebook. Each time a simple explanation is offered, it collides with a detail that refuses to fit. Eventually, a group of internet investigators posted a deep dive analysis, citing property records that indicated Mr. Harlan once lived in a neighboring state under a different name. They unearthed an old newspaper clipping showing a younger Harlan in the background of a police raid on a suspected crime family. Could it be that he'd gone into hiding? If so, the presence of the masked men might hint at old debts or vendettas come calling. The girl might have been an informant or an estranged relation. The puzzle pieces keep shifting, never quite locking into place. In an interview with a local radio station, one neighbor claimed she'd seen Mr. Harlan late at night on rare occasions, standing in his driveway, gazing up at the stars as though expecting someone or something to arrive. She described an aura of sadness about him, as though he carried a lifelong burden. She never spoke more than a few words to him, but every time she passed his house, she said it felt heavy, like the air itself resisted her presence. She dismissed it as an overactive imagination, but after the porch incident, she wondered if her intuition had been correct all along. Meanwhile, the convenience store clerk, Sam, gave an interview on a small YouTube channel. He insisted the girl seemed terrified and that she had bruises on her forearm. He recalled the final words she muttered before rushing out. "I don't have time, he's coming." Sam tried to ask who he was, but she was gone before he could finish. Though Sam's account doesn't prove anything definitively, it adds a layer of urgency to the timeline. If we try to stitch the timeline together, the girl surfaces at the convenience store, apparently fleeing someone. She possibly meets the masked men at the warehouse, either forced or coerced. She obtains something from the tall figure near the intersection. The item could be a key, a code, or evidence meant for leverage. Then she heads to Mr. Harlan's house. The masked men follow in the van, presumably wanting whatever she has. Or perhaps they already had it, and she's leading them to Harlan. They converge on the porch around 11:32 p.m. The door chain rattles, and in that charged instant, everything unravels. Some watchers of the footage note that the girl's posture on the porch suggests not just fear, but anger, her fists clenched, her jaw tight. At one point, she seems to spit out words at the door, her face contorted. If we read her lips, it might look like she's saying, "You did this," or "This is your fault." This led to the theory that she blamed Harlan for something, possibly forcing her into this precarious position. Could Harlan have orchestrated a scenario where she had no choice but to come to him for help, knowing the masked men were right behind her? All the while, the occupant remains largely unseen, except for that single word. Why, spoken in a tone that suggests both confusion and accusation? Why indeed? Why was she there? Why were the masked men hunting him? Why did the door open just a crack, only to close again as everyone vanished? These mysteries swirl like a storm, never settling long enough to form a clear picture. In the final frames before the static, the masked man with the crowbar is poised to pry open the door. The leader stands a few steps behind him. The other two flank the girl, and she's pressed almost flat against the porch rail. Her eyes flick once more toward the camera. Some interpret that glance as a plea for help, as if she knows they're being watched, hoping someone will come to her rescue. Others see it as a silent farewell, a moment of resignation that suggests she's making a sacrifice she'd planned all along. Then the static, a burst of gray snow on the feed, less than a second, but enough to break continuity. When the picture returns, the porch is empty. A detective analyzing the raw footage reportedly said the glitch was too brief to be a typical power surge or routine interference. It looked more like deliberate tampering. If that's true, who tampered with it and how? Could the occupant have had control over the camera, or was it an outside party? Did someone hack the feed, or did the moment of disappearance coincide with some event we have yet to comprehend? After the porch incident, police canvassed the neighborhood, but few residents admitted to seeing or hearing anything. A couple claimed they noticed headlights around that time, but no one wanted to sign an official statement. Fear, apathy. Perhaps both. People tend to avoid entanglement in strange affairs, particularly when masked intruders and missing persons are involved. Mr. Harlan's property was searched thoroughly, but the official report remains sparse. Rumor has it there were faint traces of footprints leading into the backyard, then stopping at a tall fence. Beyond the fence is a strip of woods that leads to a small creek. Police dogs followed a scent up to the water's edge, then lost it. A neighbor, walking his own dog near the creek the next morning, claimed he found an empty black glove snagged on a tree branch. He turned it into the authorities. Testing revealed no conclusive DNA or evidence. Another dead end. With so little to go on, the case fell into the realm of speculation and rumor. Over time, the fear dulled, replaced by a sense of uneasy acceptance. People boarded up their windows, locked their doors, and told themselves that the nightmare had passed. But those who took a deeper interest kept digging, certain that there was more to the story, an undercurrent of organized crime, or a personal vendetta, or even a larger conspiracy. Yet the puzzle remains unsolved. The occupant, Mr. Harlan, never re-emerged. The girl, captured in those fleeting frames, is still unidentified. The masked men disappeared as if they never existed. The The white van, long gone. And that single question, why, continues to echo. If you found this story compelling, join me for more mysteries and deep dives. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell on my channel. We have many more questions to unravel, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. But that was only the beginning, or so the rumors say. The days after the vanishing porch incident were filled with speculation, but for many in the neighborhood, life resumed a mundane rhythm. They went to work, came home, pretended they hadn't seen the patrol cars that briefly stationed themselves on the corner. However, beneath that surface calm, a few determined individuals, the kind who refused to accept unsolved mysteries, continued to poke at the edges of the story. Their curiosity wasn't satisfied by the official dead ends or the hushed tone with which the police addressed any inquiries. One such individual was a college student named Grace. She rented a small room down the block from Mr. Harlan's house. Before the incident, she hardly noticed the old man or his property. She was busy juggling classes, part-time jobs, and social obligations. But once word spread about the security footage, Grace became obsessed. Something about the girl's face, the way her lips formed a desperate plea, struck a chord. Grace dove into every online forum discussing the event, devouring each rumor or half-baked theory. She reached out to the local police, only to be politely turned away, so she began her own investigation. Grace was no professional detective, but she was methodical. She compiled a spreadsheet of every snippet of information from the rumor mill. Sightings of the white van, alleged glimpses of the girl, any mention of Mr. Harlan's past. Then, late at night when her roommates were asleep, she combed through property records, old newspapers, and archived social media posts. She discovered that Mr. Harlan had indeed moved to the neighborhood 30 years prior, buying the house outright in cash. Before that, his name simply didn't appear in any accessible public record. A blank slate, as though he'd sprung into existence fully formed. The more Grace dug, the more anomalies surfaced. For one, Mr. Harlan had no listed employment history. A few vague references to government work popped up here and there, but nothing concrete. A Freedom of Information Act request turned up nothing, officially at least. His finances were a puzzle too. No recorded bank loans, no mortgages, and only sparse tax documents that placed him in various locations across the state, never for more than a year at a time. This pattern ended abruptly when he purchased the suburban house and stayed put. Why? Curiosity led Grace to the local library, where she scanned decades-old microfilm for mentions of Harlan or any suspicious events. She found a cryptic article about a disastrous fire in a neighboring county that claimed multiple lives. A younger man with the same last name was listed among the presumed dead, but the body was never recovered. The cause of the fire remained undetermined, and local whispers pointed to foul play. Though the article didn't confirm a relationship to Mr. Harlan, Grace suspected a family connection. Her theory: the man who died in the fire might have been a son, brother, or nephew. If so, could that tragedy tie into the events now unfolding? As Grace gathered pieces of the puzzle, she also began to notice she was being watched, or so she believed. It started with small things: a car idling on her street longer than usual, an unfamiliar figure in a hoodie seemingly loitering outside her campus building. She brushed these off as paranoia at first, but her instincts wouldn't let them go. Something told her to be cautious. She started varying her routes home, texting a friend whenever she left a location. This only fueled her determination. She felt she was onto something big, something worth risking a bit of fear for. One evening, Grace decided to pay a visit to the house itself. The police tape was gone by then, and the property sat silent behind a half-rusted fence. The lawn was overgrown, as though Mr. Harlan's disappearance had left the grass to fend for itself. The windows were dark, the curtains drawn. The front door looked weather-beat, the porch boards sagging under neglect. A single street lamp threw a yellowish circle of light over the driveway, and there stood no sign of the white van or any other vehicle. Stealing her nerves, Grace approached the porch. A wave of déjà vu washed over her, thinking of the girl on the security footage. She knocked lightly, half expecting no answer. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the buzzing of a nearby insect and the faint hum of the street lamp. She tried the doorknob. Locked. She peered through a crack in the curtains, only darkness. Then as she started to turn away, she heard a soft thump from inside, barely audible, like a footstep on the far side of the room. Her heart lurched. She whispered, "Mr. Harlan," no response. Another faint thump, or perhaps it was the settling of old wood. Fear rippled through her. The wise move was to leave, but curiosity rooted her in place. She pressed her ear against the door, straining to catch any further sound. All she heard was the rapid thudding of her own pulse. After a few tense seconds, she stepped back and walked away, forcing herself not to break into a run until she reached the sidewalk. That night, she wrote about her experience in an online forum dedicated to local mysteries under a pseudonym. She asked if anyone else had tried to visit the house since the incident. A few responded that they had, but none had heard noises inside. One person, however, claimed that they'd seen a faint light flicker in the basement window around midnight, like a flashlight beam moving in slow arcs. This detail matched local rumors that the basement was the focal point of the investigation. If people were sneaking in, why, and who? Days turned into weeks, and Grace continued to chase leads. Meanwhile, a piece of the puzzle emerged from an unlikely source, a homeless man named Clyde. He appeared on a local talk show, claiming he'd witnessed something the night of the incident. According to Clyde, he'd been sleeping in a nearby alley when the white van sped past, nearly clipping a dumpster. Moments later, he saw the girl run by on foot, her face pale as death. She darted behind a cluster of trash bins, as if hiding. Then, the van's side door slid open, and two masked figures hopped out, scanning the alley with flashlights. The beams danced over the bins, but somehow missed the girl. After a tense minute, the figures got back in, and the van peeled away. Clyde swore up and down that the girl remained crouched in the shadows for a long while, trembling, before she rose and limped off in the opposite direction. While Clyde's story didn't mention the porch, it added a valuable piece to the timeline. The girl had been on foot at one point, evading the masked men. If she was truly their captive or target, it meant the porch incident might have been her last stand, the moment she could no longer run. This clashed with theories that she'd been working with them. Could it be that the references to "don't trust her" in the notebook meant someone else in the group had doubts about her cooperation? Or perhaps she'd switched sides at the last moment, deciding to betray them. When Grace cross-referenced Clyde's account with local CCTV, she found that a security camera near that alley had been disabled for exactly 20 minutes that night. This was too neat to be a coincidence. Whoever was behind the masked men had the resources to manipulate camera feeds, or they anticipated their locations. The incident on the porch also involved a suspicious camera glitch. Grace's suspicion that a larger network was at play grew stronger. The next logical step was to visit the old warehouse rumored to be their base. The warehouse was a hulking relic from the industrial era, a series of interconnected buildings with shattered windows and rusted metal siding. It sat at the end of a long, pitted road, overgrown with weeds and littered with debris. Officially abandoned, it was known locally as a squatter's haven and occasional hideout for illicit activities. According to some rumors, the masked men had been seen in the area multiple times, particularly at night. Grace decided to check it out in broad daylight, hoping to avoid any confrontation. She arrived one afternoon and found the main gates chained shut, a sign reading "No Trespassing" slanted against the fence. Through the gaps, she could see the decaying buildings, some with caved-in roofs, others partially boarded up. A crow perched on a broken window frame, its caw echoing in the emptiness. She circled the perimeter until she found a section of fence where the chain links had been cut, likely by other trespassers. Taking a deep breath, she slipped through and carefully made her way into the yard. Inside, the air smelled of rust and damp concrete. Shards of broken glass crunched underfoot. Grace ventured into one of the larger structures, guided by dusty rays of sunlight streaming through holes in the ceiling. Empty crates and wooden pallets were stacked haphazardly, graffiti covered the walls, and puddles of stagnant water dotted the floor. She found evidence of human activity, discarded food wrappers, cigarette butts, a makeshift fire pit, but no sign of recent occupation. Still, something felt off. She noticed scratch marks on the floor, as though heavy objects had been dragged across it, and footprints leading deeper into the building where the light didn't reach. Summoning her courage, she followed them into a corridor that led to what might once have been an office space. The door was half off its hinges, the interior dark. As she stepped inside, her foot caught on a ragged strip of fabric that looked like it had been ripped from a piece of clothing. She bent down to examine it. Maroon in color, possibly from a hoodie. A jolt of adrenaline shot through her veins. Could this be from the girl in the video? She snapped photos with her phone, then heard a faint sound, like metal scraping against concrete. Instantly, she killed the phone's flashlight. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall, struggling to control her breathing. For a moment, the corridor fell silent again. Then came another scrape, closer this time, as though someone was sliding a heavy object across the floor. Grace's mind conjured images of masked figures, crowbars, duffel bags. She debated whether to run or investigate. Curiosity won out. She inched forward, hugging the wall until she reached a small window looking into the adjacent room. Peering in, she saw a large, open space filled with filing cabinets, some overturned, others rusted shut. There in the dimness, two figures stood facing each other. One was tall, wearing a dark coat, though not masked. The other was shorter, draped in a cloak-like garment that obscured their features. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices echoing in the hollow room, but Grace couldn't make out their words. Then, with no warning, the taller figure yanked open a filing cabinet drawer, causing the scraping sound. Papers spilled onto the floor. They both knelt, rifling through them. Grace's heart pounded. She quickly snapped a photo through the grimy glass, but the flash reflex kicked in despite her best effort to disable it. A burst of light reflected off the window. Instantly, both figures froze and looked up. The taller one lunged toward the corridor, shouting something. In a panic, Grace bolted, nearly tripping over debris as she fled back the way she came. She could hear footsteps pounding behind her, the clang of metal as someone gave chase. Her lungs burned, and fear spurred her forward. She burst out of the warehouse, sprinted across the yard, and ducked through the cut fence. Only after reaching her car did she glance back to see if anyone had followed. No one appeared, but she wasn't about to linger. Back in her dorm room that night, Grace shook with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. She reviewed the single photo she'd captured, a blurry image of two silhouettes in a dark room, their faces indiscernible. It offered no proof of who they were, but it confirmed that someone was actively searching the warehouse for something. She posted a redacted version of the photo online, omitting details that might identify her. Speculation exploded in her forum thread, with theories ranging from a secret government base to a cult rummaging for relics. A few trolls called her a liar, but many pleaded with her for more details. This was more than Grace had bargained for. She found herself in the crosshairs of something potentially dangerous. Yet she couldn't ignore the possibility that her discoveries might connect to the porch incident. The men in the warehouse could be linked to the masked group. She thought about the maroon fabric scrap. That night she dreamt of the girl in the footage, cornered against the porch railing, eyes flashing with dread. In the dream, the girl whispered, "You have to find me before they do," over and over. Meanwhile, a small break emerged from official channels, though not willingly. An anonymous leak delivered an internal police memo to a local blogger known for exposing corruption. The memo contained references to Operation Rook, a cryptic initiative that seemed to involve surveillance of specific sites around town, including the warehouse and Mr. Harlan's home. The memo hinted at cooperation between local law enforcement and an unnamed federal agency. Key phrases like potential asset retrieval and contingency plans in effect painted a picture of a secret operation. The blogger posted the memo, redacting certain portions to protect the source. The public was left baffled and suspicious. Official statements predictably dismissed it as misinformation. Grace read the memo with wide eyes. Could Mr. Harlan have been an informant, or was he the asset in question? The mention of contingency plans might explain the sudden glitch in the camera feed and the disappearance of everyone on the porch. Perhaps the masked men weren't criminals in the traditional sense, but operatives or rogue agents. And the girl, was she a pawn or a rival asset? There was also mention of the Redwood file, presumably a code name for some piece of intelligence or documentation. It appeared that the Redwood file was crucial enough to warrant discreet surveillance rather than a full-scale raid. Grace realized the warehouse office might have housed old records tied to Redwood. The men she saw could have been rummaging for these documents before the building was either locked down or demolished. And that tall figure, no mask, but an air of authority, could he be part of the same network that orchestrated the vanishings? In the following days, Grace's paranoia intensified. The sense of being watched returned tenfold. She noticed a black SUV parked across from her building on 3 separate occasions, each time with tinted windows, engine running. Whenever she left the building, the SUV would pull away casually, as though it had no interest in her. Her phone battery drained suspiciously fast, and she feared it might be tampered with. She started taking precautionary steps. Using a VPN, switching devices, and logging her findings in a secure offline journal. One evening, while working late at the campus library, Grace stepped outside for a break. She found herself alone in a dimly lit courtyard. As she sipped a vending machine coffee, a voice spoke from the darkness. "You're pushing where you shouldn't." She nearly dropped her cup. A figure stood against the far wall, face obscured by a hood. Grace's first impulse was to run, but something in the figure's posture suggested they weren't about to attack. The voice was low, calm. "Look, I don't want to hurt you, but you're messing with things you don't understand. This goes deeper than you think." "Who are you?" Grace asked, her voice trembling. "Someone who knows more than you, that's all." The figure shifted, revealing the faint outline of a lean build, perhaps male. "Stay away from the warehouse and stop posting photos. They see everything." "Who's they?" she demanded, stepping forward despite her fear. But the figure hissed, "Keep your voice down," and withdrew deeper into the shadow. Grace's mind raced. She wanted to confront this person, ask about the porch incident, the masked men, the Redwood file, but all she managed was, what happened to the girl? The figure hesitated, then replied, "She's alive for now. But not if you keep digging." Grace's heart jumped, proof the girl was still out there somewhere. "Where is she?" she pressed, but the figure turned away. "This is your last warning." "Drop it." Then with a sudden agility, the hooded person ducked around the corner. By the time Grace reached the spot, they were gone. She was left in a swirl of night air, the fluorescent hum of the courtyard lights buzzing overhead, and the uneasy realization that she was in way over her head. Over the next few nights, Grace slept little. She mulled over the cryptic warning, "The girl is alive for now." That single statement fueled her desire to continue, but it also terrified her. If powerful forces were at play, government operatives, organized crime, or something in between, what hope did she have of cracking this case wide open? Yet the girl remained the emotional core of Grace's investigation. The frantic knocking on the porch, the desperate flight from the van, the possibility of betrayal or captivity. Could Grace really abandon that face to an unknown fate? She decided she couldn't. So carefully, she contacted the blogger who had leaked the police memo, hoping to form a discreet partnership. She used a burner email, referencing certain lines from the memo to prove she was genuine. The blogger, who went by Hawthorne, responded with interest but also caution. They agreed to swap information under strict security protocols. It was through Hawthorne that Grace learned of another potential witness. A local paramedic claimed to have responded to an emergency call near Mr. Harlan's, addressed the night of the incident, only to be waved off by a pair of men in suits who flashed federal badges. The paramedic found it odd that no official records were made of the call, and that the suits offered no explanation beyond "situation under control." He later discovered the entire block's phone records for that hour were either missing or heavily redacted. This reinforced the idea that a clandestine operation was unfolding that night, overshadowing any normal police response. Meanwhile, the city seemed to teeter under a sense of subdued anxiety. Strange events spiked across the region. Unexplained blackouts, phone lines going dead for hours, a run on certain medical supplies in local stores. In hushed tones, people connected these disruptions to the same shadowy group behind the vanishings. Though no official narrative linked the incidents, it felt like puzzle pieces scattering across the same table, waiting for someone to assemble them. Bolstered by these findings, Grace took another risk. She set up a meeting with Clyde, the homeless man who claimed to have seen the girl flee from the van. They met at a soup kitchen downtown. Clyde was reluctant to talk at first, clearly wary of drawing attention from the masked men or anyone associated with them. But Grace offered him a meal and treated him with respect, listening to his story without judgment. Gradually, Clyde opened up, revealing a detail he'd never mentioned publicly. He overheard one of the masked figures shout, "Don't let her reach Harlan." That single sentence suggested that the masked men actively wanted to prevent the girl from getting to Mr. Harlan's house. If so, her arrival at the porch was an act of defiance, possibly her last resort. Clyde also mentioned something else, a slip of paper fluttering to the ground from the girl's pocket when she ducked behind the trash bins. He managed to pick it up after she left. The paper had an address and a date scrawled on it. He no longer remembered the full address or the exact date, but he recalled it was for some place near the industrial harbor, and the date was the same day as the porch incident. A rendezvous she was supposed to keep, maybe, or an earlier meeting that went awry, forcing her to flee. Grace took copious notes, her mind spinning with possibilities. Was this address linked to Redwood? Why the harbor? She shared her findings with Hawthorne, who promised to dig around for property records or shipping manifests that matched Clyde's hazy recollection. Over the next week, Hawthorne found a deserted pier near the harbor that was recently leased by a shell corporation. Its name, Redwood Consolidated. It was too direct a link to be coincidence. Redwood was more than just a file. It was an entity, or at least a cover name, operating right in their city. This discovery electrified Grace. She was on the verge of something big, perhaps the core reason behind everything. The porch standoff, the masked men, Mr. Harlan's disappearance. If Redwood Consolidated was orchestrating covert operations, it could explain the federal involvement and the hush from local authorities. She suspected Redwood had some stake in retrieving Mr. Harlan or the girl, or silencing them both. The question was, why? Determined to investigate the pier, Grace planned a nighttime reconnaissance. But before she could finalize her plans, an incident jolted the city. A local news report detailed a fire at the abandoned warehouse. By the time firefighters arrived, the structure was engulfed in flames, and part of the roof collapsed, rendering any salvage operations impossible. The city claimed it was likely caused by vagrants or faulty wiring, but Grace and many online speculators suspected arson, a deliberate move to erase evidence. The timing, so soon after Grace's infiltration, felt more than coincidental. The blaze destroyed not only potential evidence, but also any hope Grace had of finding those two mysterious figures. She watched the news footage with a sinking heart, seeing the building she'd explored reduced to a skeleton of twisted metal and ash. If Redwood had orchestrated the fire, it meant they were covering their tracks, and perhaps they knew someone had snooped around. The net was closing in, and Grace felt the weight of the hooded figure's warning, "Stay away." Yet paradoxically, the destruction of the warehouse only reinforced Grace's resolve. She saw it as proof that Redwood, or whoever was behind this, had something to hide, something worth burning an entire complex for. If they were that desperate, it meant the truth could be even larger than she'd imagined. She steeled herself, deciding it was time to visit the pier. The sense of impending danger was intense, but she refused to stop. If the girl was alive and in trouble, if Mr. Harlan was a key piece of some monstrous puzzle, Grace wouldn't stand idle. Under the cover of darkness, she drove to the industrial harbor, parking her car a few blocks away. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and diesel. Cranes loomed like silent sentinels, and the water lapped at the docks in a rhythmic hush. She wore dark clothes, a cap pulled low over her forehead. Taking a small flashlight, she crept along the fences until she found the pier listed under Redwood Consolidated. The gate was locked, but a quick search revealed a loose section of fence. She slipped inside, heart hammering. The pier was quiet, the water reflecting the moonlight in shattered shards. A large warehouse stood at the end, more modern than the one that had burned down, presumably used for storing imports or exports. Windows were dark, but a single light illuminated a door on the side facing the water. She inched closer, taking care to avoid any cameras she might spot. To her surprise, she noticed that many cameras were either turned off or pointed away, as if intentionally leaving blind spots. Her first sweep of the perimeter revealed a row of shipping containers stacked 3 high. Approaching them, she heard faint voices emanating from somewhere nearby. She clicked off her flashlight and pressed herself behind a container. Carefully, she peered around the edge. A group of men stood a short distance away, some wearing dark suits, others in casual work clothes. They conversed in low tones. The words were indistinct, but she caught phrases like manifest, deadline, and shipment. None of it confirmed anything about the girl or Redwood's broader objectives, but it hinted at a covert operation in progress. Suddenly, a new figure emerged from the warehouse door. Tall, wearing a heavy coat, hair slicked back, carrying a clipboard. The group fell silent as he approached. He handed a set of papers to one of the men, then gestured toward the shipping containers. Though Grace couldn't hear, she sensed urgency in his manner. Then, as the group dispersed, the tall figure remained alone for a moment, gazing out over the water. The moonlight revealed a coldness in his features. Grace snapped a quick photo, careful to disable the flash this time. Though the image was grainy, she could see his face clearly enough to recognize if she saw him again. She waited for the tall man to return inside before creeping forward to inspect the shipping containers. Each bore a stenciled label with a code, something like RCXXXX for Redwood Consolidated. She tried opening one, but it was locked tight. The locks looked new, no sign of rust. As she scanned the area, a sudden scuff of footwear on concrete behind her made her freeze. She whipped around, only to see no one. Her breath caught in her throat. She considered leaving immediately. Maybe she was pushing her luck. But she saw a small office trailer near the warehouse, its windows slightly ajar, a faint light glowing within. If Redwood kept documents on site, that might be where they were. Summoning every ounce of courage, she approached the trailer, scanning for guards. None in sight. The door was locked, but the window was easy enough to nudge open further, and Grace hoisted herself through, landing softly on the floor. The interior smelled of stale coffee and dust. A single desk lamp illuminated a cluttered surface strewn with shipping logs, invoices, and a computer. She rifled through the paperwork, photographing anything that referenced Redwood or unusual shipments. Her pulse raced, time stretched thin, she felt exposed, vulnerable. Then she spotted a file labeled R Consolidated Security Plans. Inside were maps of the facility, camera placements, and a schedule that indicated certain nights labeled asset transport. One was circled in red, dated 2 weeks from now. The shipping route was from this pier to an unspecified location inland. The type of cargo wasn't stated, just a code, Class 7. She also saw a small note at the bottom. Coordinate with H. Could H refer to Harlan? She snapped photos as quickly as her shaking hands allowed. Suddenly, footsteps thudded on the wooden steps outside the trailer. Voices drifted through the thin walls. Without hesitation, Grace killed the desk lamp and ducked under the desk. The doorknob rattled, followed by the scrape of a key. Light from the outside flooded in, revealing the silhouette of a man stepping inside. Grace's heart pounded so loudly she feared he'd hear it. The man fumbled for the lamp switch, muttering a curse under his breath when it wouldn't turn on. A flashlight beam flickered around the trailer, passing over the walls, the desk, the floor. It momentarily illuminated Grace's shoe, but he didn't seem to notice. Then he sighed and stepped out, locking the door again, presumably concluding that the bulb had simply burned out. Grace waited until his footsteps receded before releasing a shaky breath. She carefully crawled to the window and eased herself back out. Every muscle in her body felt taut as she crept away from the trailer, scanning for any watchers. Reaching the fence, she found her earlier entry point and slipped through, adrenaline still coursing through her veins. Only when she was safely back in her car did she allow herself to exhale in relief. The documents she photographed contained more detail than she could parse in one sitting, but it was clear Redwood was no simple front. They had scheduled transports, coded cargo, and references to outside coordination. The mention of H was either a coincidence or another piece of the puzzle linking Redwood to Mr. Harlan. Grace felt certain Redwood played a central role in orchestrating the events that led to the porch incident and subsequent disappearances. Yet for all her sleuthing, she still lacked one critical lead: the girl's whereabouts. That was her primary focus. If the tall man or Redwood had her captive, how would Grace possibly free her? She was just a college student, armed with nothing but a phone full of clandestine photos. She needed allies, people with resources or knowledge to take this further. Hawthorne, the anonymous blogger, was helpful, but only so much. Grace considered reaching out to the paramedic, maybe even Clyde again, but something told her she needed to approach the next step carefully. Redwood wouldn't hesitate to silence a meddling amateur if they felt threatened enough. In the wee hours of the morning, Grace pored over her newly acquired documents. One curious notation read, "Relocation protocol in effect post-incident." The date matched the porch event. Another line mentioned subject G, with a status marked as retained. G for girl, or was it a coincidence? She cross-referenced Redwood's logs and found repeated references to subject G over the past few months, each time noting transfer facility T-7 days, or subject secured at safe house. Grace's hands shook. This was the first tangible proof that Redwood was holding someone, presumably the girl. A plan began to form in Grace's mind. If Redwood intended to move subject G in 2 weeks with their asset transport, she might have one shot at intercepting or exposing them. But she couldn't do it alone. The operation was too big, too well-funded. She needed to gather every shred of evidence, get it to someone with real authority or a wide platform, and coordinate a rescue. Yet trust was in short supply, given local law enforcement's suspicious complicity and the federal presence that might be pulling the strings. As dawn broke, Grace finally allowed herself a few hours of restless sleep. She dreamed of the girl again, this time behind the chain-link fence at the pier, reaching out to Grace with pleading eyes. The van loomed behind her, headlights off, and masked figures slid open the door, beckoning the girl inside. She mouthed silent words, "Help me." Grace awoke in a cold sweat, heart hammering, determined to see this through no matter the risk. The next day, she reached out to an investigative journalist she'd followed for years, a woman known for exposing corporate corruption and government cover-ups. Though this journalist was national level, Grace hoped the Redwood story would be big enough to catch her attention. Using a secure channel, Grace briefly outlined the situation, attached a few redacted files, and waited. Hours later, a response arrived. Interest peaked, but caution advised. The journalist wanted more concrete proof before she'd risk a major exposé. Grace felt a pang of frustration. She had proof, but verifying it without blowing her cover was tricky. She decided to share the Redwood schedule, focusing on the upcoming transport date. The journalist agreed it was a potential lead, but warned Grace not to attempt anything reckless. They arranged an encrypted line of communication in case Grace uncovered more. Time was short. Each day brought the Redwood transport closer. Meanwhile, tensions in the city seemed to escalate. An uptick in strange occurrences, sirens wailing at odd hours, black SUVs spotted in multiple neighborhoods, rumors of nighttime helicopters circling the outskirts put everyone on edge. Grace found it harder to sleep, her nerves taut as she balanced school assignments with her secret mission. She visited Clyde again, sharing what she'd learned in cautious terms. He grew anxious at the mention of Redwood, urging her to be careful, reminding her of the masked men's ruthlessness. Hawthorne, the blogger, did some digging into Redwood's corporate structure, uncovering a labyrinth of shell companies. Each one existed only on paper, funneling money in circles. Redwood's public-facing office was a small suite in a downtown high-rise, staffed by a skeleton crew. Attempts to enter were rebuffed politely, with the receptionist stating Redwood dealt only with wholesale clients by appointment. Security cameras covered every angle of the office corridor, and a guard watched the lobby. It was a fortress of plausible deniability. The question loomed: how to stop Redwood's transport and free the girl. Grace lacked the means to stage a rescue operation. She considered reaching out to vigilante groups, but that was too extreme and unpredictable. Another angle was to blow Redwood's cover publicly, forcing the authorities' hand. But if law enforcement was compromised, Redwood might move faster or simply vanish with the girl before public scrutiny could take effect. A grim scenario played in Grace's mind. Redwood transferring the girl to an unknown location, far beyond reach, as soon as they caught wind of an investigation. She could end up like Mr. Harlan, spirited away without a trace or worse. The only viable approach seemed to be a coordinated sting, but how to orchestrate that without official support? As days ticked by, Grace and Hawthorne mapped out Redwood's likely routes from the pier. They identified potential choke points, a major bridge, a highway on-ramp. If Redwood was moving subject G, they'd likely do so in a controlled convoy with minimal stops. One of these choke points was near a toll plaza. Hawthorne suggested leaking the Redwood schedule to a friend in highway patrol, someone rumored to be clean. Grace hesitated, but realized it might be the best shot. A routine inspection blitz at the toll could stall Redwood's convoy just long enough for the journalist to arrive with cameras rolling. The risk was Redwood might pivot to a different route, but at least it was something. They set the plan in motion. Hawthorne's contact in highway patrol, referred to only by a code name, agreed to the sting with the condition of total anonymity. Everything was hush-hush, off the books. Grace watched the clock anxiously as the transport day approached, feeling a mixture of anticipation and dread. She couldn't shake the vision of the terrified girl on that porch or the possibility that Redwood might have hurt her beyond rescue. Finally, the chosen night arrived. Grace parked herself in a discreet spot overlooking the toll plaza, phone in hand, adrenaline coursing through her. Hawthorne was stationed further down the road, ready to capture video if Redwood's vehicles were stopped. The journalist was on standby, set to deploy a breaking news story online if they successfully confirmed Redwood was transporting a person against their will. A tense wait ensued. Hours dragged. The occasional car or truck passed through the toll, but no sign of a distinctive convoy. Then, near midnight, headlights emerged on the horizon, multiple vehicles traveling close together. Grace's heart pounded as she counted 4 black subs. Each had tinted windows and no front license plate. The highway patrol units were in position, waiting for a prearranged signal. As the convoy approached the toll booths, the patrol officers stepped out, signaling for a routine inspection. The lead SUV hesitated, braking suddenly. All at once, the second SUV swerved, accelerating to bypass the toll. Patrol officers shouted, drawing weapons. A chaotic scene unfolded. The lead SUV tried to reverse. The third vehicle nearly collided with it. The fourth squealed to a stop, men in suits jumping out, brandishing guns. A flurry of radio chatter crackled in the night. The standoff was tense, with officers demanding the occupants step out. Grace could see it all unfold from her vantage point, hands trembling. She prayed the girl was in one of those vehicles, that they might rescue her before violence erupted. But Redwood's men didn't comply easily. One occupant flashed a badge, possibly federal. The officers, uncertain, hesitated. In that moment, the second SUV, which had swung around, roared back onto the highway. A high-speed chase ensued, patrol cars tearing after it. The men in the other SUVs continued arguing with the police, buying time. Grace cursed under her breath, realizing Redwood's real cargo could be in the fleeing vehicle. Desperate, Grace texted Hawthorne, "Follow the chase." Hawthorne replied they were on it. A swirl of confusion filled the toll plaza. Eventually, the men in suits convinced the patrol they were on legitimate business, though the specifics weren't overheard. The lead SUV sped off unimpeded. Only the chase after the second SUV continued. Grace started her car, planning to follow from a distance, but by the time she got onto the highway, the police pursuit had vanished into the night. She drove aimlessly for a while, scanning for flashing lights, hearing only static on her scanner app. Then a single update: the fleeing vehicle had disappeared. No sign of a crash or abrupt turn, just gone. It felt like a gut punch. Redwood had outmaneuvered them, likely using the lead SUVs as a decoy. Grace parked on the roadside, head in her hands, tears of frustration slipping down her cheeks. She'd come so far only to see Redwood slip away. Where was the girl, still captive, heading to some unknown facility? The plan had crumbled under Redwood's apparent connections and cunning. Hawthorne's text came through, "I lost them. They had a backup route. Sorry." Grace stared at the phone, numb. All that planning, all those risks, and Redwood was still a step ahead. The only solace was that the public confrontation at the toll plaza might generate attention. News choppers arrived too late to see the chaos, but the blogosphere lit up with rumors of men in suits, unmarked SUVs, and a confrontation with local patrol. Official statements would likely spin a cover story, but cracks were forming in Redwood's veil of secrecy. Grace returned home, hollow with defeat. She collapsed on her bed, phone notifications pinging nonstop. Messages of support and gratitude poured in from viewers who had followed the chase. Journalists requested interviews. Law enforcement wanted her statements. She was catapulted from amateur detective to frontline whistleblower overnight. Yet all she could think about was the occupant, Mr. Harlan. Redwood took him too, the girl had implied. If Redwood had the means to vanish again, would they do so, taking him deeper underground? Days passed in a blur of interrogation and public scrutiny. The Redwood men arrested at the toll plaza refused to talk, or else spouted lines about national security. Their lawyers, presumably financed by Redwood's hidden coffers, were equally tight-lipped. Grace cooperated with investigators, sharing the documents and footage she'd gathered. She prayed it would be enough to unmask Redwood completely. But the powers that Redwood had infiltrated moved slowly, if at all. Then, another tip arrived, anonymous just like before. A single text message on Grace's burner phone, van sighted near Old Orchard outside city. Redwood back route, a location was attached, coordinates leading to a rural area. Could Redwood be stashing the girl there? Or was it just another dead end, a trick to lure Grace into danger? She couldn't ignore it. Hawthorne agreed to tag along, camera ready. They left at dusk, navigating winding roads that led to an overgrown orchard, the sign out front so faded it was unreadable. The place felt abandoned, no lights, no houses, just rows of gnarled fruit trees under a cold moon. The orchard's dirt path eventually ended at a dilapidated barn. Cautiously they explored, flashlights sweeping across rotting crates and old farm tools. No sign of Redwood or the girl. A cruel joke, perhaps. Then behind the barn, they found fresh tire tracks in the mud, leading deeper into the property, vanishing into a thicket of trees. Grace's heart pounded. If Redwood was here, they'd hidden well. She snapped photos of the tracks, her breath fogging in the night air. Hawthorne scouted ahead, but the path was impassable by car. Just when they were about to turn back, a faint glow caught their eyes, a reflection, maybe from a piece of metal. Crouching low, they moved closer, discovering a deserted campsite, an old fire pit, recently used. Beer cans, cigarette butts, footprints, and the partial remains of a Redwood-labeled shipping crate, pried open and empty. They photographed everything, but Redwood themselves were nowhere to be seen, nor the girl. It seemed Redwood had relocated once again, leaving traces for anyone persistent enough to follow, or possibly trying to throw them off. As Grace turned to leave, she noticed something half buried in the ash of the fire pit. A small metal ring attached to a broken piece of plastic. She fished it out, carefully brushing off soot. Stamped on the plastic was a partial ID number, reminiscent of a hospital bracelet. Her pulse quickened. Could it belong to the girl? The orchard search yielded no definitive rescue, no direct confrontation, but Grace felt she was close. Redwood was slipping, leaving clues behind in their haste. They had grown more reckless since the toll plaza fiasco. If she could piece these clues together, maybe she could corner Redwood again, but this time without giving them an easy escape. She and Hawthorne posted updates online, urging anyone with information to come forward. The public, already hooked on the Redwood saga, responded with an outpouring of tips, some verifiable, many outlandish. The question remained, where was the girl, and what had Redwood done with Mr. Harlan? This second deep dive only escalated tensions. Hawthorne's blog faced repeated DDoS attacks. Social media accounts bearing Redwood's name popped up with cryptic threats, and Grace's phone once again showed signs of tampering. But she pressed on, fueled by the memory of the girl's frightened face, the occupant's unanswered why, and the possibility that Redwood's agenda went far beyond simple crimes. If you found this story compelling, join me for more mysteries and deep dives. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell on my channel. We have many more questions to unravel, and I'd love to have you along for the journey. The live stream cut in and out as cell signals wavered in the remote area, but enough data got through to show a chaotic chase unfolding on dusty back roads. News outlets that caught wind of the footage scrambled to send helicopters and mobile crews, eager for the scoop. Drivers on nearby highways reported an unusual convoy of black SUVs speeding past, sirens blaring in the distance as local police tried to intercept. Redwood's carefully constructed secrecy was cracking. Grace and her small group, still hidden in the woods near the abandoned compound, breathed shaky sighs of relief. They had exposed Redwood, at least partly. The compound might yet be operational, but it was no longer invisible. Satellite images would soon be poured over, questions asked, official statements demanded, but none of that assured them of the girl's safety. She was out there in a van, possibly controlled by Redwood's driver or perhaps under the mercy of some desperate henchman who realized the operation was compromised. Hawthorne ended the live stream after a final sweeping shot of the compound's fenced perimeter. He turned to Grace, face pale. "We did everything we could." "Not yet," Grace said. She refused to let the story end without the girl's rescue, or at least confirmation of her fate. She wanted closure, a certainty that the silent figure from the porch would not be lost in Redwood's labyrinth again. "We have to follow up." "What else can we do?" he asked, gesturing to their vantage point. "We're on foot, our cars are miles away. Redwood's men have a head start." Grace glanced at the hunters, who had stumbled upon them earlier. One had a small pickup, battered by years of off-road use. It was crowded but big enough to carry them. "Any chance you could give us a ride?" she asked. They agreed, though apprehension flickered in their eyes. As Redwood's men fired sporadic shots in the distance, the group sprinted through the forest until they reached the truck. They piled in, hearts pounding, and sped off toward the nearest paved road. Once on the main route, they turned on a radio to catch local news bulletins. Disjointed reports spoke of a high-speed chase crossing into the county's main highway. Police were tight-lipped, but eyewitnesses flooded social media with clips of black SUVs weaving through traffic. Some reported seeing a van driving erratically, nearly sideswiping other vehicles. Another unconfirmed post mentioned men leaning out of an SUV brandishing weapons. Redwood was burning every bridge in a desperate attempt to flee with their cargo. Grace clenched her fists, picturing the girl, cuffed and frightened, at the mercy of Redwood's driver. Could she attempt an escape mid-chase, or would Redwood's men do something drastic to ensure she never talked? As they neared the highway, the hunters tried tuning into a police scanner app. They caught fragments of calls for backup, references to fleeing vehicles. The chase was heading west near an overpass. Another voice crackled. "Shots fired on Bridgeview Overpass. Civilians in danger." Grace's gut twisted. They soon reached an intersection where police had set up a barricade. An officer waved them to a stop. "Roads closed," he said. "We have an active pursuit. Turn around." Grace leaned forward, speaking quickly. "We have information on the suspects. They're holding a hostage, a girl." The officer frowned. "Ma'am, I can't let you through. It's not safe." His radio crackled with an urgent update. "Suspects possibly armed." "Proceed with caution." She pleaded. "We've been tracking Redwood. They took the girl. Please." The officer eyed the group, uncertain. Then, with a resigned nod, he said, "Fine, but stay behind us." No heroics. He moved a patrol car, creating a gap. The pickup followed squad cars at a distance. Sirens pulsed in the darkness, leading them to Bridgeview Overpass, a stretch of elevated highway now clogged with flashing lights and improvised roadblocks. They parked behind a line of patrol cars, stepping out to witness a tense standoff on the bridge. Two black SUVs and a battered van had barricaded themselves, occupying the center lanes. Redwood's men were heavily armed, using the vehicles for cover. The tall man from the compound stood near the van's rear door, scanning the perimeter with a fierce scowl. The girl was nowhere in sight, possibly locked inside. Police crouched behind cruisers, weapons drawn. A negotiator used a bullhorn to demand Redwood's surrender. Suddenly, the tall man hauled someone out of the van, a slight figure with hands bound. The girl. She staggered, nearly collapsing. Even from a distance, Grace saw bruises on her face. Redwood's men yelled demands: safe passage, no cameras, or they'd kill the hostage and blow the bridge. One brandished a small remote, claiming the SUVs were rigged with explosives. A collective gasp rippled through the police line. Grace's heart thundered. She recorded everything on her phone, streaming it live to Hawthorne's channel. Thousands watched in real time, hearts pounding at the drama unfolding. The negotiator tried to reason with Redwood, offering them a way out if they released the girl. Redwood refused. Their ringleader, that tall man, seemed desperate, glancing at the city lights behind the blockade as though searching for a miracle. The tension on the overpass grew unbearable, thick with the possibility of violence. One Redwood operative suddenly defected, raising his arms and stepping away from the group. "This wasn't the plan," he shouted. "We were never supposed to hurt anyone." The tall man whipped around, pistol raised, calling him a traitor. Shots rang out, bullets ricocheting off concrete barriers. The defector dove behind a patrol car, surrendering to the police. Redwood's men exchanged panicked glances. The standoff erupted. The tall man demanded a getaway vehicle. Police refused. Redwood threatened to detonate the explosives. SWAT teams positioned snipers on nearby rooftops. In a flash of motion, Redwood tried to drag the girl back into the van. She resisted, tears streaming down her cheeks. The negotiator shouted for calm, but Redwood's nerves were frayed. More shots were fired. Civilians trapped in their cars cowered behind them. A bullet shattered a windshield, setting off a car alarm's shrill wail. Amid the chaos, a SWAT marksman found a line of sight. One shot tore into the tall man's shoulder, making him drop the remote. Redwood's ranks broke. Some tried to retrieve it, others scrambled for the subs. Police surged forward, guns drawn. The van lurched, tires squealing. The driver tried to flee but slammed into a guardrail. Smoke rose from under the hood. Redwood's men were pinned by crossfire. One by one, they fell or surrendered, the entire blockade collapsing under the barrage of law enforcement. The girl stumbled free, nearly collapsing on the pavement. An officer rushed to shield her with a ballistic vest, dragging her behind a patrol car. Grace felt tears burn her eyes. The hostage was safe at last. The tall man lay bleeding near an SUV, powerless. His remote was kicked away by SWAT. Another Redwood operative tried to climb out a side window, but was wrestled to the ground by officers. The standoff ended in a cacophony of shouted orders, sirens, and tearful relief. Paramedics arrived, tending to the wounded. Redwood's final act of defiance, a threat to blow the bridge, remained unrealized. The alleged explosives were found in the SUV's trunk, real enough to have caused catastrophic damage. The bomb squad carefully disarmed them, a sobering reminder of how close the entire city had come to tragedy. Grace sprinted forward as soon as the scene was deemed clear. Hawthorne followed with his camera, capturing every second for the viewers who had prayed for this outcome. They found the girl sitting on the curb, trembling, her wrists raw from zip ties. An EMT was checking her vitals. Grace knelt beside her, whispering, "You're safe now, it's over." The girl looked at her with wide, tear-filled eyes, recognition dawning. She managed a shaky nod, too exhausted to speak. The Redwood men were hauled away, cuffed and injured, their plan in ruins. News helicopters circled overhead, beaming live footage to a stunned public. The occupant, Mr. Harlan, was still missing, but Redwood's leadership had finally been exposed, forced into open confrontation. The damage was done, but the worst was over. In the ensuing days, the girl recovered in a secure hospital, shielded from further threats. She confirmed that Redwood had coerced her to lure Mr. Harlan out. He held information they needed, some code or data tied to a secret project. She knocked on his door in desperation, hoping he'd either help her or at least prevent Redwood from seizing her. Instead, everything spiraled out of control. As for Mr. Harlan, Redwood had taken him, but she didn't know where. She caught only glimpses of him on the night they vanished from the porch, forced into the van with her. The police, now under intense public scrutiny, launched a manhunt for any Redwood operatives still at large. The orchard compound was raided, turning up more evidence of Redwood's paramilitary ambitions. Federal agencies took over, citing national security, yet bureaucracy and red tape slowed the process. Grace feared Redwood might have stashed Mr. Harlan in another remote facility, beyond immediate reach. A week after the bridge standoff, Grace received a cryptic note. "Harlan is alive, seek the orchard." She recognized the orchard from earlier leads, a place no longer in Redwood's main files. Perhaps Redwood had left him to die there, or a sympathetic insider was tipping her off. Joined by Hawthorne, she went to investigate the old orchard once more. In a dilapidated barn, they found Mr. Harlan slumped against a wall, bruised and dehydrated, but alive. He clutched a battered folder containing lines of code and references to a project Redwood had called Redwood's Backdoor, a means to infiltrate critical systems. He whispered, "I couldn't let them have it," before collapsing into Grace's arms. They saved him just as a lone Redwood operative appeared, gun drawn, desperate to retrieve the code. A brief struggle ensued. Hawthorne tackled the man, disarming him with the help of Grace and the orchard's caretaker, who had alerted the police. Sirens wailed, and Redwood's last ghost was taken into custody. Mr. Harlan recovered slowly in a secure hospital, under guard. He testified about Redwood's origins, naming individuals who once worked with him in a clandestine government program. The code was destroyed, or so authorities claimed. The occupant's guilt weighed heavily on him, knowing his old work had spurred such violence. But the girl was free, Redwood dismantled. The city breathed easier, though bullet holes on the overpass and rumors of Redwood's deep connections served as reminders of how close darkness had come. Grace returned to her life, forever changed. She had dived into a mystery sparked by a single porch knock and uncovered a conspiracy that almost toppled everything. The footage of that fateful night, of the girl knocking, of masked men approaching, remained an eerie symbol of how quickly normalcy can shatter. But at least those who survived could begin to heal. If you found this story compelling, join me for more mysteries and deep dives. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell on my channel. We have many more questions to unravel, and I'd love to have you along for the journey.